He leans forward, checks the instruments again, and calls for verification. But the signatures keep multiplying, stretching in a long, steady arc advancing directly toward the capital. Within minutes, senior admirals gather around the table, their uniforms wrinkled from a night without sleep. They listen as the duty officer reads the updated report. The phrase that follows freezes the room. Multiple high-altitude bombers. Approaching from the south. Outside, the city still sleeps, unaware that for the first time in the war, shadows from the far horizon are crossing into the skies of the Japanese homeland. And those approaching shapes lead directly into the wider story of how the war reached this moment. By mid-1944, Japan stood at a crossroads it had long feared, but could no longer avoid. The empire's early victories, sweeping across the Pacific, dominating Southeast Asia, and striking at distant outposts, had created an illusion of strategic invulnerability. For years, Japanese planners believed the homeland lay far beyond the reach of direct American air attack. The vast expanse of the Pacific, combined with Japan's island strongholds, was supposed to serve as an impenetrable shield. But by June 1944, that shield was breaking apart. The turning point had come with the American capture of the Mariana Islands. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were not just stepping stones across the ocean. They were launch pads. Airfields on these islands placed the U.S. Army Air Forces within striking distance of the Japanese home islands for the first time in the war. And the aircraft designed to exploit this strategic shift was unlike anything Japan had ever faced. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The B-29 was a leap in wartime technology. Capable of flying over 30,000 feet, cruising long distances with heavy bomb loads, and equipped with advanced defensive armaments, it represented a new generation of air power faster, higher, and more resilient than any bomber deployed before it. Japanese interceptors struggled to reach such altitudes, and even when they did, the B-29's speed and defensive firepower made interception costly and often ineffective. Inside Tokyo's military headquarters, reports from the Marianas Campaign were studied with growing concern. Many officers recognized that once the Americans operationalized the B-29, the war's center of gravity would shift. Yet the full psychological weight of that reality had not yet settled in. The idea of American bombers appearing over Tokyo still felt distant, theoretical, a problem for the future. But the future arrived faster than expected. The first experimental B-29 raids originating from China had already hinted at what was coming, though their impact was limited by supply challenges. Still, they served as a warning. When the Marianas fell, it was no longer a question of if Japan would be struck, it was a question of when. And as the skies above the Pacific opened to American air power, Japan's leadership braced for a challenge unprecedented in its history. That challenge would soon reveal just how unprepared the empire truly was. Japan's defensive architecture in 1944 was built for a different kind of war, one in which threats approached gradually through naval fleets or isolated carrier groups. Its air defense network, centered around fragmented radar coverage and limited fighter coordination, was never designed to confront a long-range, high-altitude bomber force capable of striking directly at the heart of the empire. Radar stations along the coastline were few, aging, and technically inferior to Allied systems. Their range was limited, and their detection accuracy weakened significantly at high altitudes. Operators often mistook distant weather patterns for aircraft. Even when contacts were confirmed, delays in relaying information from coastal outposts to Central Command created critical gaps. Minutes mattered, and Japan was losing them long before the first bombs fell. Interception was an even greater challenge. Most Japanese fighters, such as the Mitsubishi A6N0 and Ki-43 Oscar, had been designed for agility and dogfighting, not for climbing rapidly to 30,000 feet. Their engines struggled in thin air, their weapons froze, and pilots pushed their machines to the brink just to reach the bomber's altitude. Even the newer interceptors like the Ki-44 and Ki-61 were limited by fuel shortages, mechanical strain, and lack of oxygen equipment. Squadrons that managed to climb high enough found themselves facing tight B-29 defensive formations armed with 12 heavy, 50 caliber machine guns. Inside Tokyo's command centers, the Army and Navy wrestled with coordination problems that further weakened defenses. The two services shared responsibility for airspace, but their communication networks operated independently. Instead of a unified, rapid response system, Japan relied on parallel chains of command that often overlapped or contradicted each other. As American pressure increased, these divisions became increasingly costly. Yet perhaps the most important factor was mindset. Many senior officers still clung to the belief that Japan's spiritual resolve and defensive determination would compensate for technological disadvantages. This belief, rooted in pre-war doctrine, created an atmosphere of misplaced confidence. Warnings from younger officers, engineers, pilots, radar specialists were often dismissed as overly cautious. But machines, unlike morale, do not bend to willpower. And as the B-29 threat grew, Japan's senior leadership began to feel the weight of a new reality pressing against their command tables. The moment was coming when that reality would no longer be theoretical. It would be visible in the sky. The first sighting of B-29 formations did more than alert Japanese radar operators. It exposed a quiet fear that had been growing within Japan's air command. For months, staff officers had submitted cautious reports about the Empire's shrinking defensive perimeter and the inevitability of American long-range bombers. Yet these warnings were softened as they moved upward through the rigid hierarchy. When the radar traces finally appeared over Tokyo, the shock inside the command rooms came not from confusion, but from the realization that their unspoken concerns had now materialized. Much of this fear stemmed from the B-29's technological superiority. Japanese officers understood aviation well enough to recognize the Superfortress flew higher and faster than anything in their defensive inventory could reliably intercept. Its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and immense range reflected an industrial capability Japan could not replicate. To the men watching the reports appear on the situation boards, the B-29 was not just an aircraft. It was a symbol of a widening technological gulf that no tactical brilliance could close. But the deepest shock came from understanding what these bombers represented strategically. Their appearance meant the war had reached a new stage. For the first time in generations, the Japanese homeland lay within the reach of sustained, methodical air attack. This went beyond military calculation. It struck at the psychological core of a nation built on the belief that its islands were shielded by distance, geography, and divine protection. As the first formations approached, senior admirals understood that the fight was no longer about distant territories. The skies above their own capital had become the front line. Japan's defensive blind spots became painfully clear the moment the first B-29s crossed into home island airspace. Radar stations along the coast struggled to track high-altitude formations, often losing the signals in atmospheric interference. Interceptor units scrambled late, climbing desperately toward aircraft they could barely reach. Pilots reported oxygen shortages, engine strain, and frozen weapons at altitudes where the B-29s cruised with ease. Inside command centers, officers watched as carefully planned interception diagrams failed to align with the reality unfolding in the sky. The defenses they had trusted for years were not collapsing. They were simply outmatched. This technical vulnerability quickly evolved into a psychological one. Japanese officers and civilians alike had grown accustomed to hearing of distant battles, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Philippines far from the mainland. But the sudden presence of American bombers directly over Japan shattered a long-standing belief in national immunity. Factories halted production as workers rushed outside to watch the contrails high above. Streets fell silent during air raid warnings, not out of discipline but out of disbelief. Even within the military, younger officers spoke quietly of the dawning realization that Japan was entering a phase of the war for which it was not prepared. Compounding these challenges was the persistent tension between the Army and Navy. Both branches technically shared responsibility for air defense, yet their communication networks and operational doctrines rarely aligned. Coordination delays, duplicated orders, and conflicting assessments weakened response times. In many ways, the enemy in the sky exposed the deeper enemy within an entrenched divide in Japanese leadership. And as the B-29 formations pressed farther inland, that divide would soon influence every decision made in the critical hours that followed. The first major B-29 approach toward Tokyo unfolded with a precision that caught Japan's command structure unprepared. In the early hours, as the sky shifted from deep indigo to pale morning light, radar stations along the southern coast struggled to interpret the signals drifting across their screens. Operators reported intermittent contacts, high, fast, and moving in type formation. But it wasn't until multiple stations confirmed identical readings that Tokyo's Air Defense Headquarters understood what was coming. A messenger hurried into the command room, handing the latest intercept report to the senior admiral on duty. He studied the altitude over 30,000 feet and the estimated aircraft count. The numbers alone broke through the last layer of denial. These were not isolated reconnaissance planes. This was a mass formation of heavy bombers advancing deliberately toward the capital. Scramble orders were issued immediately. Fighter units at Yokota, Chofu, and Atsugi rushed to readiness, engines sputtering in the morning air. Pilots climbed into cockpits, knowing they would be fighting at altitudes where their aircraft barely functioned. Mechanics shouted final checks, signaling launch crews to clear the runways. But even in these urgent moments, everyone involved understood the limitation. The interceptors would reach the B-29s only if the conditions were perfect, and conditions rarely were. Inside the command bunker, officers tracked the formation's progress with growing tension. Every update brought the same pattern. The Americans were maintaining their altitude, maintaining their speed, and maintaining their cohesion. No sign of hesitation. No sign of vulnerability. As they moved closer, the distant drone of engines, faint at first, began to drift over the coastline. Reports from coastal observers soon followed. Contrails appeared high above the clouds, glinting in the sunlight like thin white scars across the sky. Spotters described them as silver shapes, barely visible but unmistakably unnatural in their precision. The scale of the formation became clear only when observers counted the strands spreading out behind the lead aircraft. These were not scattered bombers. This was a coordinated strike, one that signaled the beginning of a new phase in the war. In the command room, the admirals exchanged glances that needed no words. The B-29s were not simply approaching Tokyo. They were demonstrating a strategic reality Japan could no longer counter. And the moment the bombers crossed the city's defensive boundary marked the true start of the turning point that would reshape everything. As the B-29s crossed into the final stretch toward Tokyo, the city's early morning calm fractured. Air raid sirens wailed across streets still damp with night mist, their rising pitch echoing between wooden houses and factory roofs. Workers froze in place, staring upward even though the bombers were too high to be seen clearly. The sound reached them only as a distant, rolling thunder, steady, relentless, and growing louder with each passing second. Japanese fighter squadrons attempted their climb, engines screaming as pilots pushed their machines beyond safe limits. At 20,000 feet, the formations began to stretch. By 25,000 feet, oxygen shortages and engine strain forced several aircraft to break off. Only a small number pressed onward, emerging into the cold, thin air near 30,000 feet, where the B-29s waited. Those who reached firing range encountered a battlefield unlike anything they had faced before. The Superfortresses flew in disciplined, overlapping defensive form. Streams of tracer fire lit the sky, and pilots who expected scattered defensive guns instead found themselves under coordinated bursts of heavy caliber fire. Inside the B-29s, American crews remained focused on their instruments. Bombardiers studied their sights, adjusting for altitude and wind layers. Navigators called out course corrections as the formation tightened. The moment the lead aircraft reached the release point, the order transmitted across the formation with practiced ease. One by one, bomb bay doors opened, releasing clusters of explosives that tumbled through the cold air, gathering speed as Tokyo's industrial district spread out below. On the ground, anti-aircraft batteries roared to life. Operators fired blind through cloud cover, guessing at altitude and position, hoping sheer volume might break the formation. But the shells burst far below the bomber's true height. Japanese commanders watching the battlefield map saw what their crews already knew. The defenses designed for earlier stages of the war could not touch this enemy. Then the first explosions rippled across factory blocks, shockwaves shattering windows, sending workers diving for cover, igniting storage areas filled with fuel, wood, and machinery. Columns of smoke rose steadily, climbing toward the sky but never reaching the altitude of the bombers that created them. In the command bunker, the silence was heavier than the explosions themselves. The admirals watched the damage reports appear in rapid succession, each one confirming the same truth. The era in which Japan's homeland was shielded by distance had ended. And this single raid made it clear that more would follow. When the echoes of the raid faded and the B-29s turned back toward the Marianas, Tokyo emerged into a morning filled with smoke, dust, and disbelief. The damage assessments began almost immediately. Teams moved through industrial districts, documenting shattered roofs, burned storage yards, collapsed factory lines, and transportation links severed by near-miss blasts. Though the physical destruction from this first major strike was less than what later firebombing raids would inflict, its psychological impact far outweighed the structural losses. Within Japan's high command, the mood was somber and restrained. Senior admirals and generals gathered for an emergency evaluation, reviewing reports from radar stations, fighter units, and anti-aircraft batteries. The compiled data revealed a harsh truth. Only a small percentage of interceptors had reached firing height, and even fewer had managed to engage. Anti-aircraft fire had been largely ineffective. The enemy's altitude, defensive firepower, and formation discipline had rendered Japan's existing defensive system nearly obsolete in a single morning. The shock inside the command structure deepened as intelligence analysts compared performance expectations with the actual results. Every metric response time, detection accuracy, coordination speed fell short. This was not a temporary failure or a poorly executed defense. It was a structural imbalance. The Empire was now confronting an aircraft designed with capabilities far beyond anything Japan could match or rapidly counter. Civilians, too, felt the shift. Crowds gathered silently around damaged factories, staring upward at a sky that had once symbolized distance and safety. Newspapers struggled to frame the event without revealing the full extent of Japan's vulnerability, emphasizing resilience while acknowledging enemy aircraft of unprecedented scale and altitude. For the first time since the war began, the home front understood that the conflict had crossed the ocean. And as the smoke settled over Tokyo's industrial districts, Japan's leadership recognized that the next phase of the war would test the nation in ways no previous battle ever had. The long-term consequences of the first B-29 strike quickly rippled through both military and civilian spheres in Japan. Strategically, the raid forced a complete reassessment of air defense planning. Radar coverage, previously considered adequate for coastal warning, was now recognized as insufficient, especially against high-altitude threats. Fighter aircraft production and deployment plans were urgently revised, yet Japan's industrial capacity and fuel shortages made meaningful improvement impossible in the short term. Every response measured against the B-29s highlighted a structural weakness that could not be patched overnight. Psychologically, the raid shattered illusions of Homeland invulnerability. Senior officers had long maintained confidence that distance, geography, and tradition provided security. Civilians, meanwhile, experienced their first tangible proof that Japan's cities were within reach of American power. Even isolated incidents of panic, workers fleeing factories, or families huddling under stairwells, signaled a shift in national consciousness. The war had arrived at home. Newspapers and radio reports, constrained by censorship, framed the attack as a minor event. But whispers of vulnerability spread quickly through social networks, creating an undercurrent of fear that would intensify as the raids continued. For military leadership, the strike underscored the growing technological gap between Japan and the United States. It was no longer enough to rely on tradition, morale, or tactical ingenuity. The B-29s demonstrated that industrial might, strategic planning, and altitude mastery could dictate the terms of engagement. Decisions made in the following months, whether to conserve fuel, concentrate fighters, or disperse production, were all reactions to a new reality. The American air offensive was no longer distant, theoretical, or avoidable. The first raid had not only damaged infrastructure, it had forced Japan to confront a stark truth about the changing nature of modern warfare. And in the weeks that followed, the cumulative effect of continued B-29 missions began to reshape the very mindset of Tokyo's leadership. What began as fear and disbelief hardened into urgent, sometimes desperate, strategic planning. The home islands were no longer a secure rear. They had become the front line. This realization would define Japan's final months of resistance.